Hi, I'm Jez from First Coding, and welcome to this video series on building lockdown letters in Scratch. In this video, we'll be covering how we design and code the titles, as well as designing the backgrounds and the houses that feature in the game. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you that all files associated with this project, as well as other fun projects and tutorials, can be downloaded and obtained from the link provided. Okay, let's get started.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. Every good game starts with an introduction. They have titles, and where possible, it's always advisable to have a little bit of a tutorial so the player, without even venturing into the game, the player knows what's expected and how to achieve things. And Lockdown Letters is no exception. We have our title screens here, Lockdown Letters in nice big letters. Now we have some simple graphics, the same ones we're going to be using in the game. So as you can see, we're flying a paper aeroplane from a blue house to a target. And down below here, we have the basic controls. So it's space to actually launch the paper aeroplane, and we're going to use the left and the right arrow keys to fly it in the direction of the target. We have a click here button, which encourages the player to start the game when they're ready, and on clicking it, it takes us into the game as such. And this is what we'll be concentrating on in this section. So if we go to the tutorial, you can see here that we're in the familiar work area. Now, when I start any new Scratch project, I always delete the default cat. I've never used it, and it's always nice to start with a clean slate. So that's the very first thing I did. I deleted the cat, and using this option here and the paintbrush, I was able to start building up my brand new first sprite, which is going to be this title screen. It's going to be a title screen for reasons I'll explain later, rather than a background. Okay, so instead of using this opportunity to create a title screen and tutorial through a background, we're going to design it as a separate sprite instead. So as you can see here, there's various elements I've stepped through, the graphics, the title, and the controls. Now, the click here button, we are going to make this sprite into a button. So when the player is ready, they can click on it and it launches the game straight away. But in reality, the whole sprite is going to be a clickable button, not just these two words here. Because you can never assume that the player is going to behave as intended. So a player might just click on up here, perhaps, to start the game. They might click on the house or the paper aeroplane. Hopefully, they'll click somewhere on there to start the game, but they don't necessarily have to actually click on the words, click here. There's no pressure to get the design right first time. We can always go off and code this title screen, and we can always come back to it to polish it up later. So there's no pressure to get the design looking perfect straight away. Once you have a design in place, we're going to click the code tab in the top left here. And as you can see, we've got no code blocks in place at all. So let's rectify that. New games, including Lockdown Letters, will start with the click of a green flag. And the first thing we need this title screen to do is show itself. Okay, and this is done through looks. We scroll down slightly, we have a show. Okay, so it shows itself, and we can click the green flag, and there it is. Luckily, it's centralized itself, making full use of the screen, which is what we wanted. Sometimes it might not do that. So if we go into motion, we can grab a go to X and Y block. Okay, now these are the coordinates of the center of the sprite. So whatever coordinates we put in here, say 100, 0, it'll ensure that the center of that sprite is taken to these coordinates. To ensure that your sprite remains centralized, we use X and Y coordinates of 0, 0. And we know this works because when we click the green flag, it centralizes itself. One thing also to remember, if we go back into looks, we need this title screen to be at the very top of the sprite pile. So what I mean by that is we'll have all the other sprites for our game sitting behind this one, ready and waiting for when they receive the instruction to run themselves. So if we scroll down through the looks blocks, we are going to have a block called go to front. So the front layer. So this ensures that out of all the sprites we're going to create, all the visible sprites, this is the one that's going to show at the top of that pile. Okay. Clicking on the green flag won't affect things because it's only a single sprite at the minute. And likewise, when I click on it, nothing happens. So how do we make this whole sprite into a clickable button? Well, we go into events. Okay. And instead of picking up another green flag, we're going to use this one when sprite is clicked. Okay, and this sits independently to the rest of the code that we've been putting together. And basically what this does, any code blocks that we put underneath this header block, they will only run when we click on the sprite. So when this sprite is clicked, it will run any code that we put underneath it. So what code do we need to run? Well, the first thing we need to do is hide it, because the job of that title screen has now finished. Okay, it only serves as an introduction, and when the player is ready to play, they click on it and it disappears and launches into the main game. So in looks again, in the looks section, down the bottom, we have a hide. Okay, and we can test it by clicking the green flag. Click on the sprite and it disappears. If we click on the green flag again, everything resets. Okay, so we know that that function works. Now, one problem we have in Scratch is that the sprites, okay, we only have one, but imagine we have loads. The sprites, they don't talk to one another. They don't know what the other's doing. So the main game sprites won't know when the title screen has been clicked on. So how could they possibly know to run the game? Well, we're going to use something called broadcasting. And this is a way to pass messages between sprites. Imagine it like a radio broadcast. And if we go into events, you can see the broadcast blocks at the bottom of the list. And we are going to use this broadcast block here. And we can bolt it in under the hide. Using the drop down, we can specify what message we want to broadcast. And we're just going to broadcast the message of start and click OK. So when this sprite is clicked, we hide the title screen and we broadcast start. So we're shouting the word start across to all the other game sprites when we make them. And they'll be listening for this message. And when they hear the message, they will know that it's the right time to run their particular piece of code. Okay, so let's test it. We click on the green flag. Our introductory screen and tutorial appears. We click and we broadcast the start message across the whole of the other sprites. Okay, on to the next section. In this section of the tutorial, we'll be looking at the background and the borders of lockdown letters. You'll notice from the introduction screen, which we covered in the last section, that this one has a border. Now this border is a separate sprite and it's always present. I like having borders because when we have moving sprites in the game from one side to another, for example, you can hide them underneath the border and have them queued up, ready and waiting. It also frames the game really well. And I like the way Scratch games are very square in their appearance. So I'm a big fan of borders because they have many, many uses, and we'll explore the benefits of the border later on. So when we click on our game here on the introductory screen, the game launches, and as you can see here, it's set in a town with various houses, and we have sprites buzzing around. Okay, so the town itself is actually the background, and we can look at how we can change backgrounds later on when we're discussing different levels throughout the game. Another use of the border that I really like is that when we launch our paper aeroplane and I fly it to the border, you'll notice that the aeroplane sits above, I'll launch it again, sits above the border, so giving an extra bit of perspective, implying that your plane is flying higher than everything else. It's overlapping the border, you see? Okay, so let's look at how we can design the background and border. So if we go back to our tutorial work area, you can see that I've created a second sprite and just called it border. And the border is simple. It is just 4 lines going around the edge of the screen. And you can see it taking shape in the work area here. If we go to the code, just like before, we need to ensure that this sprite remains centralized at all times. So you're going to get a border that looks something like that. It's off center. So let's centralize it. Okay, we're going to grab a green flag, okay, and the go to X and Y block that we've previously used before. Now, if you remember, coordinates of 0, 0 will give us the center of the screen. So it ensures that the center of the sprite sits within the center of the screen. And we can test it by clicking the green flag, clicking start, and there you go. It is in the center, bordering the work area nicely. Because we're introducing more sprites, we're going to go back into looks and we're going to get the go to front layer again to ensure that this sits above everything else. Now we have a conflict, don't we? Because our tiles block is also pushed to the front. So which one sits first? It's a bit of a gamble. So what we're going to do, we're going to bring them both to the front, and then we're going to bring the title screen back 1 layer. And we have a block to be able to do that. It's the go backward 1 layer. So they both come to the front, and then the title screen we looked at in the previous section takes a step back. So now when we press the green flag, you'll notice our title screen now has that border sitting above it. And that border will remain in place even when we click and we launch into the main game. So let's get the background in place. Now the background is simply drawn using the backdrop here. So if I click on the backdrops and then the backdrops tab, I've cheated a bit. I already have mine in place. And you'll notice that I've kept it nice and simple. And I would recommend that you do the same. With any background that you use in a computer game, be it a platform, a strategy, an arcade, whatever game you are building, I would recommend that you keep the backgrounds as simple as possible. Okay, keep them nice and simple, because if a background is too busy, it's too colorful, it's got too much going on, it will distract the player and affect the gameplay. So I would recommend you keep your backgrounds nice and simple. And what I've done here, I've given the title again of the game here, and I've just peppered it with various town-like furniture, in particular houses with chimneys, some store houses, and I've drawn a few lines to represent the roads. And you can obviously draw any layout that you want to. I kept it as an isometric view at this angle here, just because I thought it looked nice. You will notice that I've kept the center blank, and you can see on the work area that there's a big space here. This is where our house is going to go. This is where we're going to build our house, and our house is going to be a separate sprite altogether. So I've left sufficient space for it in the game here. I could include it on the background. It wouldn't do any harm. It would mean we have to code it slightly differently to be able to do that. But for what I have in mind later on down the line, it's certainly easier if our house, where we're launching our paper aeroplane from, is its own separate sprite. Okay, so that's how we get a nice background taking shape. I would recommend that you plan it out first. You plan the layout first. You plan where all the other elements are going to go. For example, I've left space up here for the heart. Now the heart in the game is going to shrink and shrink and shrink, and it represents the feeling, the general feeling of the town. Okay, when the love is all gone, then it's game over. And the only way you can keep the spirits up, that good feeling of the town going, is by flying your letters of encouragement to the intended recipients. And that's the aim of the game. So I would recommend that you plan the layout first, knowing exactly where you're going to place the different elements of your game. And you'll notice still that our border sits nicely above everything, framing it nicely. So let's test the whole lot. If we click on the green flag, okay, we get our title screen, click here to play, and we launch straight into our game. Okay, on to the next section. Let's build our house. Now this house, as it features on the title screen, is our blue little house here, and this is where we launch our notes of encouragement from in the form of paper aeroplanes. If I run the game and click here to launch the game, you can see here that our house remains in the center of the screen at all times. It's a different color as well, so we're able to tell which is ours and which are the other residents in our town. But the nice feature that I've added is that every time we start the game, it picks a random house to be a random shaped house. Oh, unfortunately, it's picking the same one at the minute. There we go. So we've got a little house with a chimney. When we rerun it again, we've got a bigger house this time, also with a chimney. And we run it one last time, and we've got the storage warehouse building. So this section, we're going to be looking at how we code the house. If we go over to our tutorial work area, you can see the background and the border which we built in the previous section. Our house, if you remember, we left space for our house because it's not part of the background. It is going to be its own sprite. And here we have a new sprite that I've created, and I've just called it house. Now this house, it can take many different shapes, okay? And a sprite can have different appearances, and these appearances are called costumes. And as you can see on the left, I have built 4 different houses. First house is a little bungalow. Second house is the chimney and the extension. Third house is the warehouse. And house number 4 is the bungalow with the chimney. And what the computer does, it chooses at random the house that we're going to play with for this particular round. And I've named them house 1, house 2, 3, and finally house 4. Kept it nice and simple. So once you have all your different costumes for your house that you want to play with, we're all ready to code it. So head on over to the code tab, and you can see here we're all set, ready to go. The first thing we need to do is consider what happens to this house at the very, very start of the game. When the title screen is in place, what happens to this house? Well, when the green flag is clicked, we need it to hide, don't we? Okay, the title screen is above everything else, so in theory, even if this house was visible, it would still be sat underneath the title screen. But what I like to do, I like to ensure that it is completely invisible, and I use the hide block as well, just to make absolutely sure, and just to make the games that I make a bit more robust by making absolutely certain that things are behaving as they should. So for that reason, we're also going to hide this house as well as have the title screen sat above it at the very beginning. If you recall from when we were coding the title screen, when it's clicked on, we broadcast the start message. So if we go into events again, we have this block here. Okay, previously we used the broadcast start message here, but this one we're going to use instead when I receive start. So this house sprite is always listening for any messages that are being broadcast. The code blocks that we bolt on underneath here will only run when we broadcast that start message from the title screen. So the first thing we need to do is back into looks and just do the opposite of what we've previously just done, and we need to show it. So we need to show this sprite now because we are now launching the game. The backdrop appears, the title screen disappears, and our house is now visible. Go into motion just to make absolutely sure it's going to be positioned where we want it to be. I'm using the 0, 0 coordinates to ensure that it always sits in the middle of the screen. So how do we get Scratch to pick a random building? How do we get it to change its appearance at random for every time we play a new game? Well, back into looks again, because we're affecting the appearance of our sprite. And you can see here, we've got a switched costume block. Okay, and the drop down allows us to manually select what house we want it to appear to be. And okay, we could set it to house 1, or we could set it to house 2. But every time we start a new game, it's always going to go to this costume that we set here. So it's this element of the switch costume block we need to randomize. Now, randomization appears in the operators section, the green section here on the left. Clicking on it, we can see all the different maths blocks that are available to us. We are going to need 2 different blocks from this section. The first is the join. Okay, now the join block, as you can see here in the example it gives us, apple and banana, it joins or couples 2 words together to make a sentence. In this case, apple banana. And what we want this for is because we need to join the word house, which is the name of each costume for our house sprite, and where it says banana, we are going to need to generate a random number between 1 and 4, because each of our costumes is named house 1, house 2, house 3, and house 4. To pick a random number, again, back into our operators section, is this one here. Now, I love this block. You can do so much with it. In this case, we are letting it drive the randomization of the house costume. We need to change it, though, to pick a number not between 1 and 10, but between 1 and 4. If we do leave it at 1 to 10 and it picks a random number, say 8, it's going to say switch to costume house number 8. And of course that doesn't exist. So that is going to cause problems in your game. So we're going to make sure that it just picks a random number between 1 and 4. So now it's either going to switch to costume house number 1, 2, 3, or 4. So we can pick up both these blocks here and it will fit over that drop down. So now when our sprite hears the start message, it's going to show itself. It's going to position itself in the center of the screen exactly where we want it. And it's going to switch to a random costume. Switch to costume house 1, 2, 3, or 4. So let's give that a test. We rerun the code, click here, we've got our bungalow with a chimney. Let's restart our game, click here, we've got our bungalow without a chimney. Click again, click here, and we've got the extension with the chimney. Let's see if we can get the warehouse. No, we're back to a bungalow with a chimney. But you get the idea. And it just adds a little element of surprise, even to ourselves, the people who built the game, as we don't know how things are going to appear. And you can take full advantage of this in your own game. You can add random elements left, right, and center. So making the game generate random appearances, randomizing the way it looks and feels. And it makes the game even more exciting to you, the person who's designing it. Okay, we'll leave it there. Now that we have a fully working title screen, we have a nice background, and we also have a functioning randomized house in which to launch our paper aeroplanes from.